everyone. Good evening. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Fall 2024 Evening Lecture Series. We're thrilled to welcome artist Nick Lamia this evening. This season is particularly special as the New York Studio School is celebrating our 60th anniversary this year. It was on September 23rd, 1964, that Mercedes Matter and an intrepid group of dedicated artists founded the school on a loft on Broadway and moved here a few years later to our current building in 1967. Please stay tuned for many exciting events coming up related to our 60th anniversary celebrations, including a Morton Feldman concert that will take place downstairs in our clay room tomorrow evening. We have just a few tickets left, so if you're interested, RSVPs are required. You can head to our website. We'll be offering exclusive tours of our historical spaces on Friday, October 18th as part of Open House New York. And our annual benefit dinner and auction take place on Thursday, October 24th, honoring our Dean Emeritus, Graham Nixon, for his 36-year tenure as Dean. Details of all of this and more can be found on our website and in our monthly newsletters. For this evening's program, a reminder to those in person on 8th Street to please silence all cell phones during tonight's event. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. And for those of you on Zoom, you can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the clay room for light refreshments and to continue the conversation. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 2024-25 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. Now I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening. Nick Lamia is an award-winning artist whose work includes drawing, painting, printmaking, installation, and sculpture. Despite its non-objective appearance, all of his artwork is based on real, lived experience, often involving outdoor adventures in the mountains and on the ocean. His artworks are metaphoric representations of the overlap of the natural world with the constructed world of man. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as residencies at Wave Hill, the MacDowell Colony, the Robert Blackburn Print Workshop, and the Triangle Arts Association. 500 of his small-scale drawings were included in the inaugural Bronx Museum Biennial in 2011. His recent solo exhibitions include Cloud Architecture at Planthouse Gallery in New York and the Tailwaters Project at the AVA Gallery in New Hampshire, from which the proceeds went to supporting the Greater Upper Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited and their ongoing effort to protect and restore cold water fisheries and watersheds. His upcoming exhibition, titled Special Dust, will open at the Mueller Gallery at Caldwell University in New Jersey on October 3rd and will run through November 30th. Now please join me in welcoming Nick.
Kara, thank you so much for that introduction. That was lovely, and I don't think I need to say anything else because you guys get it now. You've got it all. One edit was that show in New Jersey at the Mueller Gallery at Caldwell University is opening on October 23rd. So a couple weeks from now, you guys will have an opportunity to go see it if you want to. But thank you, Kara, and thank you everyone else at the Studio School who makes these evenings possible. Sorry, I'm looking at you guys through my glasses, so everyone's blurry. But I'll do this tonight. I am really, really excited to be here. I think that this lecture series is a hidden gem of New York, and I am flattered to be a part of it. I'm usually in the audience, but tonight I'm up here, so it's a little bit different, and I thank you all for being here for it. I'm really excited to be able to have the opportunity to be here tonight to share with you all something about what I do. And some of the ideas that inspire me in my artwork. I'm really looking forward also to the question and answer period, because I really do think that it's conversation where progress happens, not soliloquy. So I'll talk at you for a little while. My students who are here will corroborate that I'm good at that. But I also am very interested in hearing what you have to say or what you have to ask afterwards. So please don't be bashful. So what you see here are two images of some relatively recent installations. One that I did in New Hampshire a couple years ago, and one that's currently up at a gallery in Milwaukee. I'm showing you these images because they're indicative of much of my recent work, and they're kind of a preview of where we will end up at the end of this talk. But to get there, it'll be helpful, and I hope interesting for you, if I can share a little bit of the history of how I arrived here. And in order to begin doing that, I want to show you these two images. I think that this is a good place to start, but I also know that these images might be confusing to you because they don't look anything at all like my artwork does. But there's a reason why I want to show these. The picture on the left is a view from my bedroom here in New York, and the view on the right is a view from my bedroom in Maine, where I spent a lot of time growing up. I think that it's obvious that these images contrast urban and rural environments, but they also symbolize a larger concept that's a common thread in my work. And though it's not the only thing that my work is about, this thread that I'm talking about provides us a good point of entry for talking about some of my objectives. And that thread is the combination of organic and geometric elements. So I think that these two bedroom views kind of sum that up pretty conveniently. By combining organic and geometric elements in my artwork, my goal is to create a visual metaphor for the intertwining of society and nature in the real world, and to promote the importance of trying to develop a more symbiotic relationship between the two. But before we get there, let me give you just a little bit more background. We're going way back now. I can't remember a time when I didn't just love to draw. My grandfather, who lived in Santa Barbara, had a really wonderful garden in his backyard. And he had all sorts of things back there that were amazing for me to look at. Each time we visited him, I could hardly wait to get out of the car and go back there, get out there, the title of the talk tonight, Get Out There. I couldn't wait to get out there and check out the artichokes and the avocados. He had asparagus, roses, figs, peaches, lemons, limes. If you can name it, he probably at least tried to grow it. And he was pretty successful at a lot of them. Here's a picture of him in that garden. You can't see the whole thing, just a little sitting area that was outside his back door. He could grow all this stuff in his garden because it was quite large. And I just loved wandering around back there and looking at the fruits and the flowers on his trees, noticing weird fungi in the compost piles, nosing around in various sheds where I thought I might come across some treasure, like a jackknife or a fishing rod. But most of the time it was just old cans of linseed oil and turpentine, left over from his days as a boat builder and a contractor. The smell of the sheds was a very particular and memorable combination of turpentine, linseed oil, and paint. And it was only while I was putting this talk together and reminiscing about those times that I realized that my earliest recollection of the smells that I associate with my studio now were originally the smell of my grandfather's garden sheds. But it's actually fitting and a little bit eerie that my first experience of the aromas of art making occurred while I was amidst the sights and smells of his garden, because at that time, his garden was where much of my limited at that time experience of the outdoors and nature took place. So I didn't know it then, but outdoor experiences and art making would end up becoming so intertwined for me that they've become one, two parts that comprise a single activity. And that is really the main story that I want to share with you all tonight, how outdoor experience became a fundamental part of my art practice. both as a source of visual content and also as the foundation of a personal studio philosophy in which I prioritize curiosity and a spirit of adventure. It was in my grandfather's garden on Easter morning in the mid-'70s, after definitely seeing the Easter Bunny, no question about it in my mind, that I distinctly remember looking at a peach and realizing that there was much, much more to it than just a round, orangey, yellowish ball. And after that, I began to look at the world much more carefully, and I began to draw all the things that I saw around me. We lived in Southern California, and after going to USC football games with my dad, I drew piles of bodies with helmets and numbered uniforms. I also loved to draw things from my imagination. I was enthralled by monster movies like Godzilla and King Kong, and I remember hours-long drawing sessions where I used stacks of my mother's computer printout paper. She was a programmer, and so she had these stacks of the lined sheets with the holes on the sides. So I was just going through those things, loving it, and thinking about Godzilla and Mothra and those sorts of things. Anyhow, I was drawing creatures and aliens and epic space battles. My interest in drawing both real objects and situations, as well as fantasy imagery, lived experience, and imagination, evolved into a combination, an apparently oppositional combination, that underlies pretty much all my artwork even now. I think it relates to my feeling that dichotomy can foster creativity, that oppositional forces can lead to fertility, and that progress is a product of embracing rather than shying from difference. So this is just a quick example to illustrate the point that I sometimes try to put together both realistic imagery. I love drawing real stuff, but I also really like using my imagination to come up with other things that are not representational of anything that you could easily name. And we're going to get back to those things in a moment. But first, just a little bit more background. During the same time that I was drawing pictures about Battlestar Galactica and knights and college football, I was introduced to one of the other loves of my life, being outdoors. My dad took me on a backpacking excursion in the Sierra Nevada. It was the first time that I had been there, and really, it was the first time that I remember being anywhere where I felt remote and cut off from everyday life, and I loved it. It was the first time that I can recall being truly outside my normal frame of reference, outside my comfort zone. I caught my first trout on a fly rod. I carried a pack that was too heavy for me for the first time. Actually, I couldn't really carry it. Other people had to help. But it still was a great memory. And I also slept on the ground for the first time. All those firsts and others happened because my dad was willing to take me out there and gently push me into unknown territory. I loved it. I didn't know then, and my dad may still not realize it, but that trip was a cornerstone in the foundation upon which I've built my whole life. Foremost among many reasons that that trip was so consequential is that even if it was unconscious at the time, I realized that getting out into unknown territory, both physically and psychologically, is important to me. In other words, I came away with a sense of adventure, a love of exploration, and a curiosity about the world which together have made me who I am now. So the two interests that I've just described, art and the outdoors, have shaped my life. Academically, they led to my degrees in environmental science and painting. Professionally, they influenced my choices to teach both ecology and art. Together, they influenced the imagery and the underlying concepts of the artworks that I make. As I grew up, I continued to seek out opportunities to explore, like backpacking on the Appalachian Trail when I was 13, but also exploration through science, which is where my attention went academically. I majored in environmental science and biology at UC Berkeley. The drawings that I did in my lab notebooks became one of the most interesting parts of my studies. And I realized that the visual representation of information interested me as much as the information itself. And I began to sense a convergence between my love of the outdoors, my interest in science, and my passion for drawing. Though it would be several more years before they came together. But meanwhile, on school breaks, which were my favorite time, I explored places that were relatively remote, but still within striking distance of campus. I went to high places, dry places, steep places, and deep places. Did you guys like the little rhyming I was doing there? I thought that was cute, maybe too cute. But I did go to all those places, and they all had a real impact on me. So I spent significant time in each of those places that I've just shown you, and they played a significant role in the things that I think about and the visions that come into my mind while I'm working and the images that end up being produced in my studio. After I graduated, I went further afield. Not this far. But I did push further afield. I continued to get a little further out there. My first job after college started in the fall of 1994 as the mate on a small boat, which I sailed with one other person from Virginia to Bermuda and then on to St. Thomas and around the Caribbean. As I imagine many of you are aware, particularly with the news that we're having over the last couple of days about the storms that are happening in Florida and North Carolina and everything else, you're all probably aware that fall is hurricane season. So like I said, I started this job in the fall of '94. In 1994, one of the stronger hurricanes that happened was Hurricane Florence, which is seen here. Except I experienced the storm firsthand. When Gary, who was the captain of the boat and the owner and the only other person on the boat, decided that we should try to outrun the storm on the leg between Bermuda and the Caribbean. That was ill-advised. Both because the storm was strengthening on a trajectory that intersected with ours, and also because it would necessitate departing on a Friday. If any of you are sailors, you know that departing on a Friday is considered to be very bad luck. And we were repeatedly and somewhat urgently reminded by the old salts hanging around St. George's, which is a port in Bermuda, that leaving on a Friday is widely regarded as bad luck, and we had some. While we didn't get hit directly by the storm, because if we had, I might not be here right now, we did get caught in the periphery of that storm, and in a 32-foot sailboat, the periphery of a hurricane is very much close enough. Plenty close enough. We were battered by wind and seas for several days and nights. One of our sails was shredded in a squall, and we lost electrical power as well. It was almost impossible to sleep because unless you wedged yourself between the hull and the side of your berth, you'd be thrown from your bunk with every wave that went past. Despite those sorts of challenges, we eventually did arrive in St. Thomas, where I got to do some more scuba diving. But I'd realized along the way that despite my love for adventure, the boat owner, Gary, and I disagreed on the specific location of the line between pushing boundaries and recklessness. So my closest friends in my family will tell you that I have lots of stories of injuries and even some tragedies that involve people who I've known. I have no desire to become the subject of such a tragic tale. So I told Gary that I could not continue courting disaster on his boat, and I returned to the US. Soon afterwards, I was very pleasantly surprised to receive an offer to become a wilderness guide for the Yosemite Institute, an unconventional school where I would get to teach ecology and geology using the park as my classroom. I was thrilled at a chance to live full-time in the place where I had collected some of my most cherished wilderness memories. I don't know what happened to Gary. I've looked, and I can't find out whatever happened to him. That's just an aside. But it was good that I got off the boat. I accepted that offer to go and teach for the Yosemite Institute, and I moved to Yosemite, where this became both my home and my workplace. And I know that you're probably thinking, like, wait a minute, I thought we were here for an art talk. We haven't even seen a picture yet. So we're going to get there, don't worry. I'm just trying to give you a full background so that you have a picture of kind of where I'm coming from. Throughout all of these activities that I've just described, I was drawing and I was collecting visual information. Not because I had any grand plans for becoming an artist. I didn't plan on using those drawings for anything later, but drawing things I was seeing and experiencing just remained a very strong parallel interest for me. It was second nature for me to have a sketchbook with me, and I used it to record visually and verbally the things that I noticed around and inside me. At the same time, I also began to develop a personal philosophy that adventure, or exploration, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't always mean traveling to remote locations. I began to feel what Harvard landscape history professor John Stilgoe described better than I ever could in the very first passage of his book, Outside Lies Magic. He wrote, forgive me, this is a kind of a long quote, but I really like it, and I think that his writing and his ideas are fantastic. He wrote, "Get out now. Not just outside, but beyond the trap of the programmed electronic age, so gently closing around so many people at the end of our century. Go outside. Move deliberately, then relax. Slow down. Look around. Do not jog. Do not run. Forget about blood pressure and arthritis, cardiovascular rejuvenation, and weight reduction. Instead, pay attention to everything that abuts the rural road, the city street, the suburban boulevard. Walk, stroll, saunter, ride a bike and coast along a lot. Explore. Flex the mind, a little at first and then a lot. Savor something special. Enjoy the best-kept secret around, the ordinary, everyday landscape that rewards any explorer that touches any explorer with magic. The whole concatenation of wild and artificial things, the natural ecosystem as modified by people over the centuries, the built environment layered over layers, the eerie mix of sounds and smells and glimpses, neither natural nor crafted, all of it is free for the taking in. Take it. Take it in. Take it in more every weekend, every day, and quickly it becomes the theater that intrigues, relaxes, fascinates, seduces, and above all, expands any mind focused on it. Outside lies utterly ordinary space, open to any casual explorer willing to find the extraordinary. Outside lies unprogrammed awareness that at times becomes directed serendipity. Outside lies magic. Although I couldn't articulate it like that at the time, and probably I still couldn't without his help, it was with such thoughts that I began to shift all my energy into visual art and began to consider that what had always been a passionate but quiet part of me might actually be my top priority. I needed guidance. So I contacted the only person who I knew in the art world. He is experienced and well-received painter, whose name I could drop, but I won't. Anyway, he was the only person I knew who was involved in this world at all. And I got in touch with him, and he told me, like, you're not gonna be able to make a go of this from the Yosemite backcountry. You should come to New York. So with his encouragement, I did. I moved here. During my years in Yosemite, I'd spent many nights, maybe most nights, on the ground in a sleeping bag. In New York, it was the same, except instead of granite, my bag was on the floor of a vacant apartment that some family friends had let me live in for my first few months in the city. In addition to my sleeping bag, I had a pair of rollerblades, a clock radio, and a backpack full of books. I had zero furniture. The most comfortable place in the apartment was the bathtub. I spent my weekend mornings reading in the tub. That was really the only place I could lie down, recline. I used the payphone on the sidewalk below to keep in touch with friends and family, and I used the rollerblades to explore my new city. And both my sons were supposed to be here tonight, but neither of them is, so I was going to tell them not to do that. But none of you should do it either. Rollerblading around the city is dangerous. I have a distinct memory of taking a rollerblading breather on the steps of the public library on 42nd Street at sunset, and realizing that I'd moved from the steep-sided Yosemite Valley to the urban canyons of New York, and that despite the obvious differences, there were also interesting parallels between the two. Each carried the potential for its own type of adventure. I spent the next 4 years immersed completely in painting and drawing here at the studio school, and then in Boston for 2 years getting a master's degree. I spent a great deal of time working from the live model and from still life, just as those of you who are students do now. But what held the most appeal for me, and what I think I learned the most from doing, was painting landscape, which makes sense considering that it had been the natural world that had kind of inspired me in the first place. When I finished my master's degree, I moved to Maine for a time, and I grew to truly love plein air landscape painting. I still feel it was my time painting outdoors from life that taught me how to manipulate the material. I found a few spots that I liked, and I painted them over and over and over and over again. As I became more and more familiar with the composition that I was using, it enabled me to observe other aspects with increased perception. I began to see colors in the landscape that I never would have believed were there before. There's so much more out there than any one person could ever imagine, which is why I could paint the same spot over and over again, because it changed at every minute. And I often tell my students that if you ever feel like you've run out of ideas or you're stuck, just go outside, look at a tree, look at a mossy rock, look at a waterfall, look at something out there, and if you look carefully enough, you'll find something to think about, and you'll find something to paint about. As I became comfortable with these repeated landscape compositions, they began to be much more formal. The decision-making process grew to be about where to place the horizontal and vertical divisions and what colors to use to solidify the major compositional areas. Those geometric decisions and their increasing importance in my mind led to some paintings that were meant to function as both abstract images as well as carefully observed landscapes. So it's a little bit difficult to tell, but this picture is one painting, and it was just meant as, it's two landscapes, but it's on one canvas, and it was, in my mind at that time, it was meant as like kind of a combination of observed landscape with an abstract idea, kind of that idea being to sort of mash them together. At night, when the sun was down, I went back to my parents' barn where I had a studio, and I painted more abstract imagery. More and more, the formal issues of division and color, the ones that I just have described, that I was exploring in those landscapes, those ideas, those formal issues, crept in until they completely took over, and I painted this painting. This one, obviously, is made up entirely of roughly vertical and horizontal divisions. So, despite its reliance on geometry and the fact that it appears totally non-referential, this painting has a direct connection to landscape for me. And it was a turning point for me. I was still pretty inexperienced when I painted this, and it's quite different from my current imagery. But it was the first time that I felt I had made a picture that could hold my dual interests in observed reality and imagination. And it led to a body of work that occupied me for years. These were some of the very first paintings that I ever was able to exhibit publicly. And for lack of a better way to describe them, these grid paintings, they developed through successive moves that I would make. I considered the moves to be either organic moves or geometric moves, and I would make them in succession, kind of in opposition to one another, going back to that idea of oppositional forces leading to something new. The geometric elements were meant to symbolize the built world of man, and the organic parts stood for nature. My intention was that placed together in a mutually supportive way, they would be a visual metaphor for bringing together the natural world and society symbiotically. This underlying principle, organic and geometric, intertwining to symbolize man and nature together, is, as I've mentioned already, a theme that I've been interested in ever since. And my work has evolved in various directions, but this theme has been a constant. So this is to give you some idea of the scale of those works. Most of the works that I'm about to show are in the neighborhood of the painting that's there on the right. Sometimes the geometric parts of the images were dominant, and sometimes the organic motifs were at the forefront. But either way, the paintings were generally pretty full of visual stimuli. At that time, I was still really very much influenced by a philosophy that I developed in graduate school, which is best summarized as, when in doubt, add more. So there was a kind of impatience to my process because I felt like I needed to try to get all my experiences into every painting every time. So that's the when in doubt, add more. But with time, that philosophy changed. Uh-oh. Hope that's not me. Might be. When in doubt, add more matured to less is more. I do want to get to more current work, so I'm going to fast forward through about 20 years, which is hard for me to even believe that I can say that, because it doesn't feel like I've been painting for that long, but I have. While we look at the following few slides, just the most important thing I think to consider is that there is a slow but steady kind of emptying out or paring away of the imagery. I'll show one painting from each year that I hope together will demonstrate a successive kind of quieting down of the pictures that's going to take us up to close to the present. Stripping away as much as I could from the pictures became kind of a goal. And I think that goal is kind of best described by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in his book, Wind, Sand, and Stars. He wrote, quote, "Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away." And that was what I was kind of aspiring to in these images. As I moved forward, I gained greater appreciation for focusing on like a specific visual event, which is kind of the way I was thinking about these, or maybe a single piece of subject matter. So if you think about those earlier paintings that I showed a moment ago, that included whole alphabets or entire lexicons in one single painting, these quieter ones operated more like focusing on one letter or a single motif at a time. So one way that I explained this process to myself was that it was as if I was magnifying portions of the visually full works and using just single small portions of them as the entire subject for new paintings. So for example, if we were to take the highlighted version, can you guys see that square around the, okay. So if you take that little section of the picture and you magnify it and you refine it, you might get the beginnings of a new, more streamlined composition like this. And further, if we then take the image on the right and rotate it and further reduce it and change its color, then we might get something like the image on the right in this slide. This is just an example, though, of what my thought process was. Generally, it's not the actual derivation of the picture. I'm just going to pause right now. Have I really been talking for 69 minutes? Doesn't seem possible. I hope not. Okay. That's what it says. Oh, I know. The counter was on before I started. Never mind. I panicked there for a second. Sorry if it feels like I have been talking for 69. But as I was saying, to be clear, that's not the actual derivation of the picture on the right. It's just sort of an example of the way that I might have been thinking. By describing it this way, I kind of make my process sound clinical or calculated, but it wasn't, and it isn't. It's a much more organic, intuitive process that's based on instinct, not a pre-planned outcome. And again, just so I don't mislead you, this series of images that I've just shown is a hypothetical example. It's reverse engineered for this talk. It is not the actual derivation of that red painting. But let me shift gears for a second and address something else that a lot of you are probably wondering about. A couple minutes ago, I mentioned that all my imagery is derived from or connected to landscape in some way. It's totally understandable if you're questioning that at this point, because none of this looks like landscape. Most people, when they see the paintings by themselves, probably don't immediately think landscape, nor do I imagine they connect the imagery to any specific place. That is by design. I want people to experience my paintings primarily on visual terms, without a specific narrative reference to pigeonhole their interpretation. But at the same time, I think it's a cop-out when artists say that their work is about whatever the viewer wants it to be about. I mean, I think it is. It's a cop-out. So it's important to me that the imagery that I make is rooted in specific situations and experiences, even if I don't often share those specifics. My hope is that my paintings provoke a feeling of recognition in the mind of the observer, and that people will feel there's something specific in the pictures, even though they may not be able to identify it by name. I want people's experience of my paintings to be influenced by their own imaginations and to be participatory in that way, but with the knowledge that there is a concrete situation or experience of mine that is fundamental to the image. Uh-oh. Oh, it's me. Sorry. I'm too nervous. I'm fiddling with this cord. Not really, but I did knock it. Anyhow, there is always a concrete situation that is related to the image. And I don't often share this stuff. I've never shared this kind of idea with a big group like this. Sometimes I talk about it one-on-one with people. But for the sake of demonstration, I am going to share a few more examples of paintings alongside imagery that will illustrate the sorts of recollections that the images came from. But don't misinterpret the following pictures. The photos that I'm going to show are not the specific source material for these paintings. These paintings and the ones that I've already shown were not painted with a specific outcome in mind. In other words, I don't think of a past experience and then set out to make a painting based on my memory of it. On the contrary, I work intuitively, making moves and counter moves that probably come from some subconscious place. And it's through making many edits and a process of building the images and then breaking them down, and then rebuilding them and breaking them down again and again, that the paintings begin to resemble something that I recognize as connected to a specific event or a location in my memory. And when I have a moment of recognition and I think, oh, this picture reminds me of this specific event or that location or experience, it's only then that I can begin to refine the imagery to make it more closely match my recollection. In other words, this is a threadbare thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. If the painting is the egg and the real life experience is the chicken, the egg came first. And it was only later connected with the chicken that laid it. So the next few images are cases where that process took place. The paintings existed and referenced my real life experiences, but only later did I locate photographs of the particular places and experiences that provide the real world context for the paintings. Since in these paintings I always worked from memory and instinct and never used photos for source material, I'm sometimes shocked at how close the photographs in the paintings actually are. You'll see in a second. I hope that you're shocked too. But anyway, some of these photos are mine and some of them are from other people. But all of them are of particular places that I've been or experiences that I've had that relate to the final painted imagery. One of the most intense experiences that I had on that sailboat was that on the outskirts of that hurricane, Hurricane Florence, a waterspout formed off our stern, and I was on watch. That trip took place with two people, as I mentioned, and one person was always awake and the other would be asleep, and you'd be in shifts of 4 hours, 24 hours a day. So I was on watch. I was up on deck. It was like maybe 4:30 in the morning or so, and I watched a waterspout form behind us, and it caught up with us over the course of a few miles, and it was really scary, but it dissipated shortly before it would have caught us. So that was lucky. And for more reasons than one. It was lucky that we didn't get hit by it, but it was also lucky because I had that experience. And I got to remember it. And then I later painted about it. But the imagery is not always inspired by some super dramatic event. It can also be quieter, poignant experiences. This picture came about in response to an old and really enormous copper beech tree that was in the Bronx at a place called Wave Hill, which I'm sure some of you know about. The tree was diseased and it had to be cut down, and I watched the whole process, which took 3 days and involved a lot of equipment and a lot of stages. I watched the whole thing, and it was beautiful, and it was also sad. This picture was based on a tarn, which is the name for a glacial lake. I've seen many tarns in my life, but I saw one particular one that really had an impact on me, and I saw it while I was climbing something called Mount Dana, which is the second highest mountain in Yosemite. I just like the way that tarns often seem to be kind of nestled into these high altitude valleys, and they're little oases of life and green amidst the cold and snowy landscape and rocky landscape around them. When we're kids, at least when I was a kid, I often would draw a simple pyramid shape to represent a mountain. And obviously, as we get older, we realize that mountains are more complicated than that. But it's also remarkable sometimes how much strict geometry there can be out there in the real world, in natural forms. This is well, it's labeled there, you can see it. It's an amazing peak in the Sierra called Cathedral Peak. This one came from one of my favorite Yosemite experiences, which was climbing Mount Lyell, which is the highest peak in the park. I climbed it with some great friends, and the image on the left is not the summit, but it shows what's called the Lyell Buttress, which is a really, to me at least, impressive landmark along the way. It really impressed me. That trip from our starting point to the top of Lyell and back was about 30 miles, and it took about 21 hours of continuous climbing and descending. So it was a one-shot deal, and it was one of the best times I've had. Sometimes the images relate not to discrete events, but rather to specific geological formations. Hanging valleys are some of my favorites. As are plutons. Does anyone here know what a pluton is? A pluton is a giant bubble of molten rock that rose to the surface of the Earth in an upside-down teardrop shape. And then it cooled and it solidified, and it eventually became exposed as layers of softer earth and rock around it eroded away. You'll know this next picture because Half Dome is one of the most famous plutons in the world. I climbed that one using that route that's highlighted there in red. But of all the adventures that I have had in the Sierra, this place is my favorite. This is called Mathis Crest. It's a massive granite fin that appears like a giant blade slicing up through the surrounding landscape. The top edge is super narrow, and it's flanked by sheer drops on both sides. In 1996, I traversed the spine of this formation with a couple of friends, Andy Mayding and Kendra Kurahara, who might be online right now. I don't know. I hope they are. They don't live here in New York. But the three of us traversed this spine. And this is what it looked like up at the top. It's a pretty incredible place to find yourself. And that experience really provided me with a ton of memories and a ton of visual information that as I said before, I didn't know it at the time, but I was filing it away, and it eventually comes out. And it comes out in images that look something like this. Or maybe like these. And just for reference, this is not my current studio, but this was a studio a couple years ago. Just showing sort of relative scale and a variety of different things that were some inspired by that Mathis Crest place and some inspired by other experiences. This painting is one of the last paintings that I worked on before COVID. I had begun to think about trying to find like a more direct connection to my subjects rather than just memories and intuition. In other words, I was thinking about whether I could reverse that metaphor. Could I put the chicken before the egg? I thought about using photographs from my excursions in a more literal way, but that was problematic because, one, I don't really have many photographs of those trips. I didn't bring a camera with me, but we didn't have phones then, so I didn't automatically have a camera, and I often was trying to conserve weight, so I wouldn't bring a camera. And secondly, the photos that I do have were taken to record fun memories. But I wasn't thinking about composition or cropping or perspective or other things that might be helpful in later putting a picture together. So I thought about using other people's photographs, but that feels weird to me and artificial. So I can't really do that. So far, I haven't been able to do that. Instead, though, I began to consider visiting remote-ish places that are close-ish to New York, specifically seeking out locations that would fit with my aesthetic and where I could either paint on site or take photographs that I'd later use. When I was researching possible destinations, it dawned on me, and this is embarrassingly obvious now that I am expressing it to you all, but I realized that the Hudson River School painters had already done a lot of this, but I do have a sort of a kinship with them, at least a philosophical kinship. You know, they explored this area thoroughly, and they also contemplated the relationship between man and nature. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself there, but you got a little preview. And they shared my belief that the natural world should be revered and stewarded. A natural extension of that thinking was to study works from the Hudson River School and distill their compositions to use in my own works. I've got a couple of examples that I'll show you here. The ones that I'm going to show you are Albert Bierstadt here. And this is a Hetch Hetchy Valley painting. Hetch Hetchy Valley is a sister valley to Yosemite Valley. It's also in the park. And it doesn't look this way any longer because it was dammed and was made into a reservoir. That's obviously controversial, and different people have different thoughts about that. But one of the things that happened for me was that while I was painting it and while I was studying its composition, I realized, oh, I can use that fact that it got filled with water as one of my compositional choices. So you can see here that I've got a vertical, as I often do, as I'm sure you've noticed, I've got a strong horizontal line, and the reason for it in this case was that the water level of that valley has risen over the years and has slowly obliterated the views that Bierstadt had when he painted his. Another example is Thomas Cole's picture of Mount Etna. And it's a little teeny drawing study. It's maybe like 3 by 5 inches there on the right. But it eventually led to this painting, which is 40 by 60 inches. So just so you can see the comparison. And then just to give you some idea about what these pictures are like in real life. What's up? There he is. Hi, Winnie. Hey. You won your game? Good work. To give you an idea about what these pictures look like in real life, I just wanted to include this quick shot. As I mentioned, this was all unfolding just before the pandemic. When COVID hit, my wife Ingrid and I and our kids, along with my sister-in-law and her family too, were very fortunate to be able to move to my mother-in-law's house, which is about an hour north of here right now. And we ended up all living together in an extended group of 10. And I got to cook every night. I like to cook. And I got much better at it over the course of those months. But we didn't know it then, and we didn't know how long we'd be there. We thought it would be a couple days at first. And then, of course, we thought it would be a couple weeks and maybe a month. And then as everybody knows, it became clear that it would be a long time before life returned to anything close to normal. Everyone here has their own COVID stories. And obviously, it needs to be acknowledged that COVID was extremely bad for a lot of people. But for me, and I always have a little bit of guilt when I say this, there ended up being a real silver lining. My late father-in-law had a workshop in his basement, which is at the house where we were living. I started spending a lot of time down there tinkering, making furniture from repurposed lumber, carving wooden spoons from the backyard firewood pile. And one day in the workshop, I came across a stash of my father-in-law's old fly fishing gear. And I knew immediately that that would be a perfect pandemic pastime for me. I'd be outdoors, I'd be remote from people, and I could relearn an old interest. I have loved fishing for a long time. It linked me to my grandfather, to my dad, to both my grandfathers, actually. But although my dad and his dad had sparked an interest in me of fly fishing, I really had never learned to do it properly. I had never learned the nuances. But, and in case you haven't realized, I will just admit it right now, I'm kind of obsessive. I've got an obsessive personality. And I got totally hooked on fly fishing during the pandemic. I fished as much as I possibly. Oh, and also, if you doubt my obsession, look at the date on the picture on the right. That was today. I fished as much as I possibly could during COVID. At one time, I racked up a streak of 58 days in a row. I would leave the house before dawn, and I would not return until late afternoon. Ingrid, and I'm sure others in our group, thought that I was crazy. And maybe that's true. But I was having a ball. I was learning, I was exploring, I was just loving it. But I also began to be bothered by a feeling that disappearing for hours every day to do something fun and interesting for me, but that was ultimately unproductive, was self-indulgent. But one day, that changed. Fly fishing for trout is generally done in an upstream direction because trout face upstream and they wait for food to come to them downstream. You can more easily sneak up on them from below. I was fishing tailwaters, which are the waterways below reservoirs, which means, of course, that there's always a dam somewhere upstream. I would access a stream far below the reservoir in order to give myself plenty of territory to cover, and then I'd begin. Almost always, dense underbrush on the banks and tree cover above blocked out the wider landscape and enabled a pleasant fantasy that I was surrounded by wilderness like Thomas Cole or Frederick Edwin Church would have been. So these are shots from places that I would go. While I explored the tailwaters of Westchester, despite the fact that I was never far from a major county road or even an interstate, the illusion that I was far from any part of man's built environment could become quite powerful. So powerful, actually, that when I finally got a glimpse of an enormous dam through the trees, it was as if I was seeing something completely alien. Similar to what, I hope this doesn't sound hyperbolic, but it really felt right to me. Similar to what I imagine it must have been like for Montezuma to witness the arrival of Spanish ships. Something totally alien and yet clearly made by man. One morning when I emerged from wandering upstream through dense, dark woods and saw the Cross River Dam for the first time, and you guys can probably recognize some of the geometry in here from other paintings that we've seen already, I realized that though they can be problematic from an ecological standpoint, dams are excellent examples of overlaps of man and nature, where water, woods, and wildlife commingle with societal infrastructure. It was a physical manifestation of exactly the combination that I'd been thinking about for years, and it had the geometry that I like. I realized that exploring the tailwaters, which, like I said, had begun to feel kind of self-indulgent, was actually a perfect way for me to collect imagery that I could use in my studio. It's a remarkable moment to come out of the dark and see what should be a familiar object as brand new and mysterious. It means that you've let go of your preconceptions about the thing and you're truly seeing it clearly. For me, that experience mimicked what painting is like at its very best. An extended period of exploratory moves, experimentation, and feeling lost, followed by a culminating and usually much too brief moment of clarity when the inherent logic of the image becomes clear. After that, seeking trout in the tailwaters became just an excuse for the real search, which was for further examples of overlaps between man and nature. I began to document my findings in photographs, which now I use in the studio as fundamental building blocks for the pictures. So I did manage to reverse that metaphor. This picture is based on the location in the previous slide. But similar to the paintings that I already shared, when people see these images, they probably don't immediately think landscape. And nor do I imagine they connect the imagery to any specific place. But when you see them together, I believe that there's a genuine relationship that becomes clear. As my interest in basing paintings on actual images of society overlapping with nature grew, so did the area where I looked for examples. I expanded my range from New York to New England. That's a print on the right, not a painting. That's a woodblock print. To New England, here's Vermont. And even further afield to California. The connection here is a little more tenuous, but it's there. And most recently to Maine. By including these photos of the actual places with this last group of slides, I've sort of given away much, much more of the source material than I usually do. Most of the time, I keep the photographs completely to myself. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to pigeonhole or dictate people's experience of the paintings too much. So I hope that I haven't ruined something by oversharing with these images. But I hope that you guys can understand the connections that I'm making. But as a palette cleanser, let's just look at a couple of paintings by themselves. So for the next few images, just allow your imagination to take over. Don't worry about what the source material is. Just look at the pictures. And don't concern yourself with where the locations are or what the experiences were. There's always something. Sometimes there's a little something that is given away in the titles, although this one's completely cryptic, except for people who lived in Yosemite with me. Sometimes there's no title at all. And sometimes the paintings get really far from their source material. So if you can think back to that slide I showed of the Cross River Reservoir, the first one that sort of gave me that epiphany, this painting, believe it or not, is based on that. There's a couple pictures that are much smaller. This is a 12 by 12 inch painting. But I want to show these because you get a much better idea for what the surface quality of the paintings is when you get something that's where you're zoomed in a little bit more. So I think this is a good example where you can kind of see the process of breaking down, rebuilding, scraping away, and painting over things. I really as I hope I've made clear, I really enjoy exploring the physical world, but I also take that philosophy into the studio, and I look at painting as kind of a process of exploration, where you never know what's going to be around the next corner, but if you just try something, you might discover something new for yourself. You might discover something lovely and magical and wonderful, but you'll never know unless you try it. So I try a lot of different moves, most of which don't work, but once in a while I find something that I really find interesting, and then I keep moving. If a particular move doesn't work in a way that I like, I just make another one and another one until something happens that I find interesting. So, these last few images are some of my most recent paintings, and some of them are included in the show that's in Milwaukee currently. Some are going to be at the show at Caldwell University in a couple of weeks. And this kind of brings us to a natural stopping point. And you guys are like, oh, thank God. Except that I suspect that there are probably at least a couple people out there in this room tonight, maybe online, who were paying very close attention at the beginning and who are thinking back to the very first images that I showed, these ones. And you're like, wait a minute. Yeah, that's all fine and good, but what about those wooden blocks and sticks and things on the ground? And what about that stuff on the wall? What's going on with that? And that's a totally fair question, because I have not talked about those things at all yet. So I do want to touch on that before we end. As I mentioned, for a long time, my artwork has been about the need for us to bring society together with the rest of the natural world in a way that's more harmonious and more symbiotic. I hoped that conversations about the paintings and talks like this one would help to spark the communication to further that cause. At a certain point, I began using sculptural elements and painting on the walls of the exhibition spaces to connect canvases in a way that was meant to reflect the sentiment of John Muir's statement, quote, "When you try to pull something out of the universe, you quickly find it connected to everything else." So I was connecting things. Each painting is painted individually. They're meant to stand alone. But when I have an opportunity, I really enjoy finding ways to connect them visually as a way of suggesting that though they are each individuals, they are also each part of a greater overall whole, just the way that any other thing in the universe is part of a greater whole. I sometimes get discouraged by the feeling that our individual actions are insignificant compared to the overall. But when I think about the way that things truly are connected, I'm reminded that we are each a part of something larger. And I aim to symbolize that by expanding the images past the boundaries of the canvas and by connecting them with one another. Just a side note, that round there in the bottom, that hamburger-looking thing, that's a piece of the huge beech tree that I watched get cut down at Wave Hill that I described a little bit ago. But that's not the trunk. That's just a branch. It was a huge tree. And when I got that, I could barely lift it because it was full of water still, and it was so heavy. And it smelled really, not bad, but really strong smell. Anyhow, I try to connect things together in this way. And I hope that pointing out such connectivity, as well as encouraging people to participate in the re-envisioning and reforming of some of my artworks, it will remind people that though their actions may seem insignificant, when we work together toward a common goal, we can achieve great things. Collectively, we can be as powerful as a storm system, I hope. Indeed, powerful enough to begin to create the symbiosis that we so desperately need to achieve between society and the rest of nature. And with that, I will wrap up, but I want to show one last picture, which is one of my favorite artworks that I have at home. It's a sign made by a wonderful Irish artist whose name is Sean Lynch. When I look at it, it reminds me of the importance of getting out there into the world with your eyes open and never take your experiences for granted. I hope that each of you will come away from tonight with a renewed sense of that importance. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Nick. I invite those of you in the room, if you have any questions, to please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. And again, for our online audience, to type your questions into the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen.
Hi.
Hi.
You spoke about how you went from adding a lot visually to going into subtracting it and like going more towards less is more and not more is more. How do you balance, or how did you balance the consciousness of it with an intuitive and subconscious process? Yeah.
I'll try to repeat it, and you can tell me if I'm accurate. I think you're asking me about, you're asking me to elaborate on how conscious I was about the process of changing from full pictures to emptier pictures. Is that about right?
More than that, it's about your conscious mind and subconscious mind, because your process is intuitive, your process is subconscious, but you still have to be conscious to not add more, right? Or like be less. Like how did your, or even if you do have an answer to it, like, you know, how are you still conscious in that subconscious process to not add more?
It wasn't necessarily a conscious change that I made with any intention of going from, these are probably the wrong words to use, but going from complicated to simple. Because the apparently simple paintings are, I think, equally complicated, maybe more so. So it wasn't a conscious decision that I made to try to simplify things, and it took a long time. So really, I think what was happening was I was just continuing to follow my instinct, but I became more excited by and intrigued by images that were less full over a long period of time. So it was a gradual process, and not one that I feel like I really was controlling. I was maybe, this is like an art school cliche, but I was probably allowing it to control me a little bit more. And so it's easily conceivable that I could go back in the pendulum could swing in the other direction and things could get more full again at some point. I would never say that I won't ever make full paintings again, but I can say that I will continue to trust what happens. And those of you who are out there who are painters probably are a lot like me, in that you make a move and then you sit for 3 hours, and then you maybe make another move if you get the courage to do it, and then you sit again. So it's a process like that, and it's in those periods of sitting that digestion takes place and ideas kind of bubble up, and you sum up the courage to give it a shot. Give one of those ideas an opportunity to be manifest. And if it seems interesting afterwards, then you keep it. And if it doesn't really work for you, then you allow the next idea to take over. And it's just through that, over the course of like 15 years, that things went from full to less full. I hope that answers what you're asking.
Nick, we have an online question.
Yes.
The question is, I'm curious that I often think that when we have a sensory experience that is not necessarily what occurs visually, that generally involves our senses and memories. Therefore, I wonder if you've ever delved into more imagined worlds and worked more from pure geometry. And then there's a second part here, if there's any interpersonal imagery, meaning figurative relationships, people, animal, fish, that have been a part of your future or past in terms of abstraction or jumping off from.
Gosh, that's a lot to remember to try to answer all of that. But yes, I love, as I said, I love drawing things from real life. I didn't really show much tonight. I showed one tree stump. There are a whole bunch of other tree stump drawings that all range from 8 by 10 inches up to probably 14 by 17 inches, so relatively small. But they are also, at least for me, they're pretty detailed and they take a long time. I love doing that. I view it as both a kind of an end in and of itself, but also a way to gather visual information that may come out again in some other form. So that's currently my most kind of direct observational, like observing nature and reproducing it, what I see. But I have also drawn animals and people. It's just not what I'm focused on currently. I think there was something in that question about using strict geometry. And I think although lots of the things that I've shown tonight and that I've worked on over the years probably appear to be just potentially purely geometric, I have nothing wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with people who are working just from geometry, and that's sort of exciting enough for them. But for me, I really enjoy more when there is some connection to a personal experience. But that said, as I described earlier, I hope I was clear, like, it's only in these most recent paintings where I've been using photographs and directly going from the photograph to the painting. Most of the time, meaning over most of the history of my painting and even currently, I really enjoy simply starting with marks and following intuition, trusting instinct. Right now, the marks happen to be mostly sort of geometric in nature because that's what I'm drawn to at the moment. And eventually they build to something that becomes more than just geometry for me, but it never really, but pure geometry is never my end goal. I hope that sheds some light on that part of the question. There was something more, I think, at the beginning of what you asked.
Yes, and I've also been asked to share that these questions are coming from Fran O'Neill.
Yay, Fran, shout out to Australia.
Yeah, the first part was asking about this idea that when we have our sensory experiences, visually we might not always see them. How do we translate the full sensory experience that one is having with sound, light, color, rain on you, right? The wind, the cold, and how that then sort of lands visually and how you're able to sort of capture the ephemeral and intangible.
I don't know if I do. I try to think about those things, but I'm using a visual language, and those things are, at least in my mind, like not necessarily part of the visual language, but they are part of they are things that have an emotional impact or sort of a haptic impact on a person, on me. And I try to translate those kind of impulses, my reaction to those sorts of things into the visual language. But there's a translation that has to take place when doing that. And that's the hard part. That's like, I don't know. I mean, I struggle a lot with whether or not the pictures, both the ones that I showed tonight and others that I didn't share, whether they are actually doing what I hope that they will do. I mean, I think that they are connected. When you see these pictures and the photographs next to them, I don't have to go all the way back, I guess, but maybe I will. When you see these pictures and you see the source material that's associated with them, there is a direct correspondence, I think. But while I'm painting them, I have a supreme struggle with not reproducing the photograph, but staying close enough to it that I'm actually still staying tethered to it in some way. Because otherwise it just kind of spins off into, you can interpret the painting however you like, which I already said, that's not really my bag. I'm not certain if I'm totally understanding the question, but I hope that illuminates a little bit what the person is hoping to, what Fran is hoping to hear or
Yeah.
seeking.
Thanks, Nick.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this really stimulating talk. It's both
Thank you.
concrete and also sort of inspiring and provocative. When I was looking at the installations and the way you talked about the connections you're making,
I'll try to get
one
to
thing
them.
I wondered, have you ever considered doing an installation or something outside? So you have a very strong relationship to the outside. I wondered if you'd ever thought about that or would be interested in that.
That's a great question. Only once have I had a real opportunity to do an installation outdoors. Regretfully, I don't have any images of it here with me tonight, but I have done one. It was up in Connecticut. It was for a residency at a place that's called iPark. And I had the opportunity to basically wander around an enormous piece of land, choose a spot, and execute a project. There was no proposal or any kind of preconceived idea about what I would do. The person who's in charge of that, of the owner of the property and the person who's kind of in charge of the of everything there, has collected. His other life is like in, I think, contracting and landscape building, and there's a lot of stuff there. And we had access to things like bulldozers and blowtorches and all those fun things. And I didn't get to learn how to drive a bulldozer, but maybe I'll have another chance someday. Anyway, I had a big space. I had access to a ton of different materials, and I could really, there was a lot of freedom. I could just pick and choose. And so I did a project that was conceived around the idea of the sort of alchemical elements: earth, air, wind, fire, and there was one other one in my case. There were 5. And I created a series of circles of different kinds. I could go into the details, I probably shouldn't. One was a well, so I literally dug a well that was about 5 feet in diameter and maybe 12 or 15 feet deep and filled with water, and I had a little structure made around it. So it was kind of like a magical, it was different from what I've shown here, but it was an opportunity for me to really do some work that literally did connect to the earth. The other parts of that kind of installation had to do with air movement. They had to do with a solstice, so a movement of larger bodies. And it also had to do with sort of what I could learn about primitive cultures that had been present in that area historically, and trying to respond to that, but also be sensitive to it. And I have to say, I loved doing that project, but it ended up being so different in appearance from what I've shown here tonight that in some ways, although I think conceptually it completely meshes with everything else, visually it's quite separate. So I'd love to have another opportunity to work outdoors. One of the ways that a lot of these installations are directly connected to the actual outdoor world, even though they're inside, is through the ingredients, right? So in this picture, it's funny that I landed on this one. It wasn't within any intention, but like, if we could zoom in, you'd see that those rougher pieces of wood are covered with lichen and different mosses, and they're really decayed. And those pieces of wood have a really special place for me because they are pieces from a treehouse that I built when I was probably 10 or 12 years old with a couple of very dear, very old friends. That treehouse had become pretty dangerous because it was rotting and slowly falling out of the tree where it was, and at that time I had little kids, and many of my sisters also had little kids, so it was like, all right, it's time to take the treehouse down, particularly because it was, I believe, in October as well, in 2011, that there was another hurricane. I can't now remember even which one, but we were preparing for it and thinking like, well, this treehouse is going to blow out of this tree and it's going to cause some damage if we don't deal with it first. So I took it out of the tree and realized, oh, I have this opportunity coming up. I'm going to save this wood for that. And so those pieces came. They're like, I have a deep connection with the stuff, physical stuff. I don't usually share that. It's not part of the artist statement or anything, but there's always some connection. And currently, I won't spend time going back to it, but you may, in the very first slides, you probably saw there are some rocks and sort of like ripped up chunks of pot buoys and other pieces of like old gym floors and things. Those are all things that have washed up on the shore at a place in Maine that I'm very deeply connected to and that I revisit as frequently as I can to collect material. Because I do find that when I have kind of what feels like a more personal connection with the objects, even if they're still anonymous to me, if they come from a particular place where I'm connected, I feel a connection to them, and it just becomes kind of, I think, easier to access whatever it is that I'm trying to access to make something that feels right to me. If it's just random materials that somebody gives me or something, I never am able to get into the right mindset with them in order to like place them in whatever way that feels, I don't know, I don't know what the word is to describe it, but there's a certain feeling when something sort of clicks and just seems like it's put down in the right way, and that's the only way that it really should be. That seems to happen for me more easily when I do have a real connection to the stuff, to the sticks and the rocks and the chunks of things.
Thank you so much, Nick. Please give him another round of applause for this wonderful conversation.